Thanks for purchasing the pattern, I guess. I'm trying to give more information than I can through image or text explanation, and I have this video to try to help you if you might be intimidated of the really thin double fold hem around the neckline. It can be tricky and it does kind of take some hand control, but it's really cool and it really opens up opportunities for finishing your blouse without having a facing or a lining or adding bias tape, especially if you're doing like a blouse out of silk or chiffon. It's really nice to just have a self-folding finish that's thin and sewn well. So it does take practice. I'm sewing on like a muslin that's just kind of crappy fabric from Walmart for $1 a yard, but I've already sewn my basting stitch, which is 1/8 inch from the raw edge, so it's a really narrow beginning, but this stitch will really help you control and fold that hem around the curve. And so before we get started on the actual sewing, the two tips I have are, first, that if your machine has an option to end with the needle in the down position when you take your foot off the presser foot, set that up. This machine I'm on does that every time. So the machine and the needle can actually help pin your fabric as you go, because we will be working in really small increments around the neckline, like 1 inch almost at a time. And so my next tip is to start, I have it zoomed in so you may not see the full neckline, but the hardest part is going to be on the front where you approach the curve from this direction and it changes and curves the other direction. So these pivoting points are the hardest. So I would suggest when you sew to start at the shoulder seam, go around the back, and then attempt the front, and then you have more experience with your fabric and the technique before you get to the hardest part. So I usually like to sew on the wrong side, so my bobbin will be the exterior or the top stitch in the end. So I'm just going to flip this actually. So I'm starting at the shoulder seam going across the back and onto the front. So with the wrong side up, you, just like any other, you fold it once and then fold it again. And so right now I'm starting on the shoulder seam, and the seam is more straight across and doesn't have as much curve to it at this point on the neckline. So that's where I kind of like to start. So I just have folded it twice, and I'm kind of just going to, with my hand wheel, pin it down, and then I can better arrange the fabric to do another double fold. Sorry, I have like huge man hands, so it made me make this harder to see. But so folding it down twice puts my basting stitch is now going to be covered and in the seam. So I'm just going to do a few stitches to get started and to kind of anchor the neckline. Okay, so the next tip is you're hemming a curve. So when you approach the presser foot, I think a lot of times we have the tendency to just straighten out the curve and sew straight because that's easier and probably more comfortable. But what will happen is your neck line will have way too much stitching, and so it will kind of wave because we put too many stitches and we torqued the curve straight and sewed it that way, and therefore it wants to lay that way. So when you approach the presser foot, you want to approach it on the angle. So the next little inch we're going to once again fold and fold, and so I'm not going to stretch this straight. I'm going to leave it in the curve that the neckline shape has, and then as I slowly stitch, we work this curve into the presser foot. And that's another reason why you have to go pretty slow. Once again, drop it there, it pins it, and then I can grab my next section, same thing, approach it and help maintain the curve of the fabric, and then we're once again sewing on an 1/8 inch again. So this final hem takes in a total 1/4 inch of fabric but the actual stitching hem that you see on the outside is half of that, which is a 1/8, which is why it can be really cool on the more delicate fabrics. So I'm kind of coming up the opposite shoulder now. I'm almost across the back here. And so this is where we're curving up to the shoulder, so you can see like the fabric kind of wants to go against it. So in a way you almost kind of have to ease in this curve as you work around it. So we're getting to the opposite shoulder seam. Trying to keep my fingers out of the way so you can see more, but and so the next thing too is a lot of times when it's this small and this tedious, you'll think like, oh, I'd rather just press this double fold around and then it'll be easier, which you can do, and depending on the fabric that may be a good option. My personal preference is not to do that, just because I think a lot of times as you sew, that there is an element in any double fold of we're hemming on a curve, so there is an element of ease that has to happen. And so if it's pre-ironed, you've already given the fabric a path of where to fold and how to lay on itself. And so I choose not to, because I think a lot of the process of getting a good finish is to allow the fabric to go where it wants to go as I'm sewing. So maybe try both ways. You definitely can make it easier if it's already folded, but I kind of, on curves like this, like to allow it to happen as I go. I don't know, it's like those sewing hippies, like this fabric speaks to you, kind of, like it has a direction that it's more comfortable in lying, and so I try to allow it. So at this point I'm on the front, I've come down on this curve, and so I'm just about to pivot to come up the other direction. So this is the part where it kind of gets tricky because the angle changes. So right now I'm coming this way, and so you can kind of see I'm going to hit the pit of the curve and come the other direction. The sewing feels a lot of the same, but so I've kind of still coming up out of the curve, but you can see here how my basting stitch is really going to help me roll that in a way that doesn't fold or pucker. And so this is where I work the slowest, is around this front. And so now we're going the other direction, so the curve is still kind of this way, but we're kind of curving on that front corner. And then I've made the curve, and so all I have to go is from the dip up to my starting point at the shoulder seam. So this is kind of the last mile of your marathon. And you made it! Almost. Okay. Back stitch. Okay. So it still will look a little wonky, just like anything. Like you can see on this curve, like the fabric's kind of wanting to, have its original. This is also, because it's muslin, it's cut on grain. If you cut on the bias, it would kind of have more ease. But when you press this, it lies flat. And like on the back, you can see it's kind of the same thing. It has some puckers, well, and that wasn't sewn perfectly, because I was kind of hurrying. But once you iron this, you should have a little scant, perfect little hem. The inside looks great. You don't have raw edges, and you didn't have to cut bias tape and add bulk. You can have a really light finish to your neckline. And so hopefully that helps to kind of see it in action. And like anything, a good press, and a lot of times when you press, you just iron it and then move on. But it's really important to let it cool in the position you want it to lie. So if you iron this, don't start torquing it while it's hot, because the fibers are still malleable. So press it, flatten it, let it cool on your ironing board, and you'll have a much more long-lasting finish, and it'll have a more permanent fold to make that neckline like a perfect, crisp, perfect little 1/8 inch hem. Hope that helps. Thanks so much. If you have any questions or you're coming into difficulty, especially once you get doing your own variations, feel free to email me, and I'm happy to answer questions. And hope this pattern works for you. If you have issues, especially fit issues, I'm here to help, and hopefully together you can have a great fitting blouse. Thanks.